This is Devices and Desires by K.J. Parker, Chapter 1. The quickest way to a man's heart, said the instructor, is proverbially through his stomach. But if you want to get into his brain, I recommend the eye socket. Like a whip cracking, he uncurled his languid slouch into the taut straight lines of the lunge. His forearm launched from the elbow like an arrow as his front leg plunged forward, and the point of the long, slim sword darted, neat as a component in a machine, through the exact center of the finger ring that dangled from a cord tied to a beam. It was typical of Valen's father that he insisted on his son learning the new fencing, the stock, the tuck, the small sword, and the rapier. It was elegant, refined, difficult, endlessly time-consuming, and of course useless. A brigandine, or even a thick winter coat, would turn one of those exquisite points. If you wanted to have any chance of doing useful work, you had to aim for the holes in the face, targets no bigger than an 8-mark coin. Against a farm worker with a hedging tool, you stood no chance whatsoever. But for 10 years, Valens had flounced and stretched up and down a chalk line in a drafty shed that hadn't been cleaned out since it was still a stable. When he could hit the apple, the instructor had hung up a plum, and then a damson. Now he could get the damson 9 times out of 10, and so the ring had taken its place. Once he'd mastered that, he wondered what he'd be faced with next. The eye of a darning needle, probably. Better, the instructor said, as the point of Valen's sword nicked the ring's edge, making it tinkle like a cowbell. Again. It was typical of Valens that he suffered through his weekly lesson, face frozen and murder in his heart, always striving to do better even though he knew the whole thing was an exercise in fatuity. Fencing was last lesson but one on a Monday. On Wednesday evening, when he actually had an hour free, he paid one of the guardsmen 4 marks an hour to teach him basic sword and shield, and another 2 marks to keep the secret from his father. He was actually quite good at proper fencing, or so the guardsman said, but the tuck had no cutting edge, only a point, so he couldn't slice the grin off the instructor's face with a smart backhand rap as he longed to do. Instead, he was tethered to this stupid chalk line, like a grazing goat. That'll do, the instructor said, 24 lunges later. For next week, I want you to practice the hanging guard and the volt. Valens dipped his head in a perfunctory nod. The instructor scooped up his armful of swords, unhooked his ring, and left the room. It was still raining outside, and he had a quarter of an hour before he had to present himself in the west tower for loot and rebeck. Awkwardly, it was too small for him at the best of times, and now his fingers were hot and swollen. He eased the ring off his right index finger and cast around for a bit of string. Usually he did much better when the instructor wasn't there, when he was on his own. That was fatuous too, since the whole idea of a sword fight is that there's someone to fight with. Today, though, he was worse solo than he'd been during the lesson. He lunged again, missed, hit the string, which wrapped itself insultingly around the sword point. Maybe it was simply too difficult for him. That thought didn't sit comfortably, so he came at the problem from a different angle. Obviously, he told himself, the reason I can't do it is because it's not difficult enough. Having freed his sword, he stepped back to a length. Then he leaned forward just a little, and tapped the ring on its edge, setting it swinging. Then he lunged again. 6 times out of 6, enough to prove his point. When the ring swung backward and forward, he didn't just have a hole to aim at, he had a line. If he judged the forward allowance right, it was just a simple matter of pointing with the sword as though it was a finger. He steadied the ring until it stopped swinging, stepped back, lunged again, and missed. Maybe I should have been a cat, he thought. Cats only lash out on moving objects. If it's still, they can't see it. He cut the ring off the cord with his small knife and jammed it back on his finger, trapping a little fold of skin. Rebeck next. Time to stop being a warrior and become an artist. When he was the Duke, of course, the finest musicians in the world would bribe his chamberlains for a chance to play while he chatted to his guests or read the day's intelligence reports, ignoring them completely. The son of a powerful, uneducated man has a hard time of it, shouldering the burden of all the advantages his father managed so well without. An hour of the rebeck left his fingertips numb and raw, and then it was time for dinner. That brought back into sharp focus the question he'd been dodging and parrying all day. Would she still be there, or had his father sent her back home? If she'd left already, if, while he'd been scanning hexameters and hendecasyllables, stabbing at dangling jewelry and picking out wire. She had packed up her bags and walked out of his life, possibly forever. Well, at least he wouldn't have to sit all night at the wrong end of the table, straining to catch a word or two of what she said to someone else. If she was still here. He cast up his mental accounts, trying to figure out if he was owed a miracle. On balance, he decided, probably not. According to the Holy Friars, it took 300 hours of prayer, or 500 hours of good works, to buy a miracle. And he was at least 60 short on either count. All he could afford, out of his accrued merit, was a revelatory vision of the divinity, and he wasn't too bothered about that. If she was still here. On the off chance, he went back to his room, pulled off his sweaty, dusty shirt, and winnowed through his clothes chest for a replacement. The black, with silver threads and 2 gold buttons at the neck, made him look like a jackdaw, so he went for the red, with last year's sleeves. But, Duke's son or not, he lived in the mountains. If it came in from outside, it came slowly on a mule. Well, simply because it was relatively clean and free of holes. Shoes. His father chose his shoes for him, and the fashion was still for Polaines with their ridiculously long pointy toes. He promised himself that she wouldn't be able to see his feet under the table. Besides, she wouldn't still be here. And pulled out his good mantle from the bottom of the chest. It was only civet, but it helped mask the disgraceful length of his neck. A glance in the mirror made him wince, but it was the best he could do. 60 hours, he told himself. 60 rotten hours. I could have made up easily if only I'd known. Protocol demanded that he sat on his father's left at dinner. Tonight, the important guest was someone he didn't know, although the man's brown skin and high cheekbones made it easy enough to guess where he was from. An ambassador from Mezentia. No wonder his father was preoccupied, waving his hands and smiling. 2 generations of courtiers had come to harm trying to point out to the Duke that his smile was infinitely more terrifying than his frown. While the little bald brown man nodded politely and picked at his dinner like a starling. One quick look gave Valens all the information he needed about what was going on there. On his own left, the Chancellor was discussing climbing roses with the controller of the mines, so that was all right. He was free to look round without having to talk to anybody. She was still here. There was a tiny prickle of guilt mixed in with his relief. She was, after all, a hostage. If she hadn't been sent home, it meant there'd been some last-minute hitch in the treaty negotiations, and the war between the 2 dukedoms, 2 centuries old, was still clinging on to life by a thread. Sooner or later, though, the treaty would be signed. Peace would end the fighting, and the desperate waste of lives and money. Heal the country's wounds, and bring the conscript farmers and miners back home. Peace would take her away from him before he'd even had a chance to talk to her alone. For now, though, the war was still here, and so was she. A small diplomatic incident, maybe. If he could contrive it that their ambassador bumped into him on the stairs and knocked him down a flight or 2, would an act of clumsiness toward the heir apparent be enough to disrupt the negotiations for a week or 10 days? On the other hand, if he fell awkwardly and broke his neck, might that not constitute an act of war leading to summary execution of the hostages? And he'd be dead too, of course, for what that was worth. Something massive stirred on his right. His father was standing up to say something, and everybody had stopped talking. There was a chance it might be important. Father loved to annoy his advisors by making vital announcements out of the blue at dinner. So Valens tucked in his elbows, looked straight ahead, and listened. But it wasn't anything. The little bald man from Mezentia turned out to be someone terribly important, Grand Secretary of the Foundrymen's and Machinists' Guild. In Father's court, secretaries were fast-moving, worried-looking men who could write, but apparently they ruled Mezentia, and therefore, by implication, the world. And he was here as an observer to the treaty negotiations, and this was extremely good. Furthermore, as a token of the Republic's respect and esteem, he'd brought an example of cutting-edge Mezzantine technology, which they would all have the privilege of seeing demonstrated after dinner. Distracted as he was by the distant view of the top of her head, Valens couldn't help being slightly curious about that. Everyday Mezzantine technology was so all-pervasive, you could scarcely turn round in the castle without knocking some of it over. Every last cup and dish, from the best service reserved for state occasions down to the pewter they ate off when nobody was looking, had come from the Republic's rolling mills. Every candle stood in a Mezzantine brass candlestick, its light doubled by a Mezzantine mirror hanging from a Mezzantine nail. But extra special cutting edge didn't make it up into the mountain passes very often, which meant they had to make do with rumors. the awestruck whispers of traders and commercial travelers, the panicky reports of military intelligence, and the occasional gross slander from a competitor, far from home and desperate. If the little bald man had brought a miracle with him, the 10,000 mark kind rather than the 300-hour variety, Valens reckoned he could spare a little attention for it, though his heart might be broken beyond repair by even the masters of the Soldierers and Braziers Guild. The miracle came in a plain wooden crate. It was no more than 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, but it took a man at each corner to move it, a heavy miracle then. 2 mezzanines with grave faces and crowbars prized the crate open. Out came a lot of straw and some curly cedar shavings, and then something which Valens assumed was a suit of armor. It was man-high, man-shaped, and shiny, and the 4 attendants lifted it up and set it down on some kind of stand. Fine, Valens thought. Father'll be happy. He likes armor. But then the attendants did something odd. One of them reached into the bottom of the crate and fished out a steel tube with a ring through one end, a key, but much larger than anything of the kind Valens had seen before. It fit into a slot in the back of the armor. Some kind of specially secure, sword-proof fastening? Apparently not. One of the attendants began turning it over and over again, and each turn produced a clicking sound, like the skittering of mice's feet on a thin ceiling. Meanwhile, 2 more crates had come in. One of them held nothing more than an ordinary blacksmith's anvil, polished true like a silver chalice, but otherwise no big deal. The other was full of tools, hammers, tongs, cold chisels, swages, boring stuff. The anvil came to rest at the suit of armor's feet, and one of the mezzanines prized open the suit's steel fingers and closed them around the hem of a 3-pound hammer. The operation of the machine... Valens looked round to see who was talking. It was the short, bald man, the Grand Secretary. He had a low, rich voice with a fairly mild accent. The operation of the machine is quite straightforward. A powerful spiral spring, similar to those used in clockwork, is put under tension by winding with a key. Once released, it bears on a flywheel, causing it to spin. A gear train and a series of cams and connecting rods transmits this motion to the machine's main spindle, from which belt-driven takeoffs power the arms. Further cams and trips effect the reciprocating movement, simulating the work of the human arm. Whatever that was supposed to mean, it didn't look like anybody else understood it either, to judge from the rows of perfectly blank faces around the tables. But then, the key-turner stopped turning, pulled out his key and pushed something, and the suit of armor's arm lifted to head height, stopped, and fell, and the hammer in its hand rang on the anvil like a silver bell. Not armor after all. Valens could feel his father's disappointment through the boards of the table. Of course, Valens knew what it was, though he'd never seen anything like it. He'd read about it in some book. The citizens of the Perpetual Republic had a childish love of mechanical toys, metal gadgets that did things almost but not quite as well as people could. It was a typically mezzanine touch to send a mechanical blacksmith. Here is a machine, they were saying, that could make another machine just like itself, the way you ordinary humans breed children. Well, it was their proud boast that they had a machine for everything. Mechanizing reproduction, though, was surely cutting off their noses to spite their collective face. The hammer rang 12 times, then stopped. Figures, Valens thought. You get a dozen hits at a bit of hot metal before it cools down and needs to go back in the fire. While you're waiting for it to heat up again, you've got time to wind up your mechanical slave. Query whether turning the key is harder work than swinging the hammer yourself would be. In any event, it's just a trip hammer thinly disguised as a man. Now then, a man convincingly disguised as a trip hammer. That would be worth walking a mile to see. Stunned silence for a moment or so, followed by loud nervous applause. The little Grand Secretary stood up, smiling vaguely, and sat down again. That concluded the demonstration. 10 minutes after he'd got up from the table, Valens couldn't remember what he'd just eaten, or the name of the trade attaché he'd just been introduced to, or the date. As for the explanation of how the heavy miracle had worked, it vanished from his mind completely. That was unfortunate. I was wondering, she repeated, did you understand what that man said about how the metal blacksmith worked? I'm afraid I didn't catch any of it, and my father's sure to ask me when I get home. So she was going home then, the irony. At last, he was talking to her, and tomorrow she was going away. Further irony, it had been his father himself who'd brought them together. Valens, come over here and talk to the Countess Serapati. Father had been towering over her, the way the castle loomed over the village below. all turrets and battlements. And he'd been smiling, which accounted for the look of terror in her eyes. Valens had wanted to reassure her. It's all right. He hasn't actually eaten anybody for weeks. Instead, he'd stood and gawped, and then he'd looked down at his shoes, plains with the ridiculous pointy toes. And then she asked him about the mechanical blacksmith. He pulled himself together like a boy trying to draw his father's bow. I'm not really the right person to ask, he said. I don't know a lot about machines and stuff. Her expression didn't change except that it glazed slightly. Of course, she didn't give a damn about how the stupid machine worked. She was just making conversation. I think, he went on, that there's a sort of wheel thing in its chest going round and round, and it's linked to cogs and gears and what have you. Oh, and there's cams to turn the round and round into up and down. She blinked at him. What's a cam? She asked. Ah, what indeed? Well, it's sort of 3 hours a week with a specially imported doctor of rhetoric from whom he was supposed to learn how to express himself with clarity, precision, and grace. It's sort of like this, he went on, miming with his hands. The wheel goes round, you see, and on the edge of the wheel there's like a bit sticking out. Each time it goes round, it kind of bashes on a sort of lever arrangement like a seesaw. And the lever thing pivots, like it goes down at the bashed end and up at the other end. That's how the arm lifts, and when it's done that, it drops down again under its own weight, nicely in time for the sticky out bit on the wheel to bash it again, and so on. I see, she said. Yes, I think I understand it now. Really? No, she said, but thank you for trying. He frowned. Well, it was probably the worst explanation of anything I've ever heard in my life. She nodded. Maybe, she said, but at least he didn't say, oh, you're only a girl, you wouldn't understand. He wasn't quite sure what to make of that. Tactically, 4 hours a week on the art of war with General Bozanus, he felt he probably had a slight advantage. A weak point in the line he could probably turn, if he could get his cavalry there in time. Somehow, though, he felt that the usages of the wars didn't apply here, or if they did, they shouldn't. Odd, because even before he'd started having formal lessons, he'd run his life like a military campaign, and the usages of war applied to everything. Well, he said, I'm a boy, and I haven't got a clue. I suppose it's different in Mezzentia. Oh, it is, she said. I've been there, actually. Really? I mean, what's it like? She withdrew into a shell of thought, shutting out him and all the world. Strange, she said. Not like anywhere else, really. Oh, it's very grand and big, and the buildings are huge and all closely packed together, but that's not what I meant. I can't describe it, really. She paused, and Valens realized he was holding his breath. We all went there for some diplomatic thing, my father and my sisters and me. It was shortly before my eldest sister's wedding, and I think it was something to do with the negotiations. I was 13 then, no, 12? Well, anyway, I remember there was this enormous banquet in one of the guild halls, enormous place, full of statues and tapestries, and there was this amazing painting on the ceiling, a sea battle or something like that. And all these people were in their fanciest robes, with gold chains around their necks, and silks, and all kinds of stuff like that. But the food came on these crummy old wooden dishes, and there weren't any knives or forks, just a plain wooden spoon. Fork? He wondered. What's a farm tool got to do with eating? Very odd, he agreed. What was the food like? Horrible. It was very fancy and sort of fussy, the way it was put on the plate, with all sorts of leaves and frills and things to make it look pretty, but really it was just bits of meat and dumplings and slimy sauce. To the best of his recollection, Valens had never wanted anything in his entire life. Things had come his way, a lot of them, like the loathsome pointy-toed Pulanes, the white thoroughbred mare that hated him and tried to bite his feet, the kestrel that wouldn't come back when it was called, the itchy damask pillows, the ivory-handled rapier, all the valuable junk his father kept giving him. He'd been brought up to take care of his possessions, so he treated them with respect until they wore out, broke, or died, but he had no love for them, no pride in owning them. He knew that stuff like that mattered to most people. It was a fact about humanity that he accepted without understanding. Other boys his age had wanted a friend, but Valens had always known that the Duke's son didn't make friends, and besides, he preferred thinking to talking, just as he liked to walk on his own. He never wanted to be Duke. because that would only happen when his father died. Now for the first time he felt what it was like to want something, but he stopped to consider, is it actually possible to want a person? How? As a pet to keep in a mews or a stable, to feed twice a day when not in use? It would be possible, of course. You could keep a person, a girl for instance, in a stable or a bower. You could walk her and feed her, dress her, and go to bed with her, but he didn't want ownership. He was the Duke's son. As such, he owned everything and nothing. There was a logical paradox here. Dr. Galitza would be proud of him, but it was so vague and unfamiliar that he didn't know how to begin formulating an equation to solve it. All he could do was be aware of the feeling, which was disturbingly intense. Not that it mattered. She was going home tomorrow. Slimy sauce, he repeated. Ugh! You had to eat it, I suppose, or risk starting a war. She smiled, and he looked away, but the smile followed him. Not all of it, she said. You've got to leave some if you're a girl. It's ladylike. Not that I minded terribly much. Valence nodded. When I was a kid, I had to finish everything on my plate, or it'd be served up cold for breakfast and lunch until I ate it. Which was fine, he went on. I knew where I stood, but when I was 9, we had to go to a reception at the Lorican embassy. She giggled. She was way ahead of him. And they think that if you eat everything on your plate, it's a criticism that they haven't given you enough. She'd interrupted him and stolen his joke, but he didn't mind. She'd shared his thought. That didn't happen very often. Of course, he went on. Nobody bothered telling me. I was just a kid, so I was grimly munching my way through my dinner. Rice, she said. Plain boiled white rice with noodles and stuff. He nodded. And as soon as I got to the end, someone snatched my plate away and dumped another heap of the muck on it and hand it back. And I thought I'd done something bad, and I was being punished. I was so full I could hardly breathe. But Father was busy talking business, and nobody down at my end of the table was going to say anything. I'd probably be there still, only... He stopped dead. Only? I threw up, he confessed. It wasn't a good memory. All over the tablecloth. And their Lord Chamberlain. She laughed. He expected to feel hurt, angry. Instead, he laughed too. He had no idea why he should think it was funny, but it was. And there was a war? She asked. Nearly, he replied. God, that rice. I can still taste it if I shut my eyes. Now she was nodding. I was there for a whole year, she said. Lorica, I mean. The rice is what sticks in my mind, too. No pun intended. He thought about that. You sound like you've been to a lot of places, he said. Oh, yes. She didn't sound happy about it, which struck him as odd. He'd never been outside the dukedom in his life. In fact, I've spent more time away than at home. Well, he had to ask. Why? The question appeared to surprise her. It's what I'm for, she said. I guess you could say it's my job. Job? She nodded again. Professional hostage. Comes of being the 5th of 7 daughters. You see, she went on, we've got to get married in age order. It's protocol or something. And there's still 2 of them older than me left. I can't get married till they are. So the only thing I'm useful for while I'm waiting my turn is being a hostage. Which means while they're doing a treaty or a settlement or something, off I go on my travels till it's all sorted out. That's barbaric, he was about to say, but he knew better than that. He knew the theory perfectly well. Statecraft 2 hours a week with Chancellor Vitarius. But he'd never given it any thought before. Like people getting killed in the wars. Something that happened but was best not dwelt on. It must be interesting, he heard himself saying. I've never been abroad. She paused, considering her reply. Actually, it's quite dull, mostly. It's not like I get to go out and see things, and one guest wing's pretty like another. And she didn't say. There's always the thought of what might happen if things go wrong. I guess so, he said. Well, I hope it hasn't been too boring here. Boring? She looked at him. Well, I wouldn't say that. Going hunting with your father was quite... Valence almost managed not to wince. I don't know that he dragged you out with him. Was it very horrible? She shook her head. I'd been before, so the blood and stuff didn't bother me. It was the standing about waiting for something to happen that got to me. Valence nodded. Was it raining? Yes. It always rains. He pulled a face. Whenever I hear about the terrible droughts in the south, and they're asking, is it because God's angry with them or something? I know it's just because Dad doesn't go hunting in the south. He could earn a good living as a rainmaker. She smiled, but He knew his joke hadn't really bitten home. That disconcerted him. Usually it had them laughing like drains, or perhaps they only laughed because he was the Duke's son. "Well," she said, "that was pretty boring, but the rest of it was—" She shrugged. "It was fine." The shrug hurt. "Any rate," he said briskly, "you'll be home for Harvest Festival." "It's not a big thing where I come from," she replied. And then, like an eclipse of the sun that stops the battle while the issue's still in the balance, the Chamberlain came out to drive them all into the great hall for singing and a recital by the greatest living exponent of the psaltery. Valens watched her being bustled away with the other women until an equerry whisked him off to take his place in the front row. Ironically, the singer sang nothing but love songs, aubads about young lovers parted by the dawn, razzos between the pining youth and the cynical go-between, the bitter complaints of the girl torn from her darling to marry a rich elderly stranger. All through the endless performance he didn't dare turn around, but the thought that she was somewhere in the rows behind was like an unbearable itch. The greatest living psalterist seemed to linger spitefully over each note as if he knew. The candles were guttering by the time he finally ground to a halt. There would be no more socializing that evening, and in the morning, early, so as to catch the coolest part of the day, she'd be going home. "I could start a war," he thought, as he trudged up the stairs to bed. "I could conspire with a disaffected faction, or send the keys of a frontier post to the enemy. Then we'd be at war again, and she'd come back as a hostage. Or maybe we could lose, and I could go there. All the same to me, so long as—" He lay in bed with the lamp flickering, just enough light to see dim shapes by. On the opposite wall, the same boarhounds that had given her nightmares when he was 6 carried on their endless duel with the boar at bay, trapped in the fibers of the tapestry. He could see them just as well when his eyes were shut. 2 of them, all neck and almost no head, had their teeth in the boar's front leg, while the third had him by the ear and hung twisting in midair, while the enemy's tusks ripped open a fourth from shoulder to tail. Night after night he'd wondered as he'd lay there which he was. Was he the dogs or the pig, the hunters or the quarry? It was one of the few questions in his life to which he had yet to resolve an answer. It was possible that he was both, a synthesis of the two, made possible by the shared act of ripping and tearing. His father had had the tapestry put there, in the hope that it'd inspire him with a love of the chase, but it wasn't a chase, it was a single still moment. Perhaps he couldn't see it because it didn't move, like the ring hanging from the rafter. And therefore it represented nothing. Tonight it made him think of her, standing in the rain, while the limers snuffled up and down false trails, his father bitching at the harborers and the masters of the hounds, the courtiers silent and wet, waiting for the violence to begin. "The peace won't last," they said. They gave it 3 months, then 6, then a year. Just possibly 3 years, or 5 at the very most. Meanwhile, Count Surapat's 3rd daughter married the Prince of Boha. Bad news for the shepherds, the lumber merchants, and the dealers in trained falcons, but good for the silver miners and refiners, who were the ones that mattered. And his 4th daughter married her 3rd cousin, Valen's 4th cousin, the Elector of Spalato. Father celebrated Valen's 19th birthday with a hunt, a 3-day battue, with the whole army marshaled in the mountains to drive the combs and passes down to the valley, where the long nets were set up like lines of infantry waiting to receive a cavalry charge. On the morning of the 3rd day, they flashed a magnificent mountain boar from the pine woods above the blue lake. One look at the monster's tusks sent the master hurrying to find the Duke. It would be nothing short of treason if it fell to anybody else. But the Duke was right up the other end of the valley. He came as quickly as he could, but when he got there, the boar had broken through, sliced open 2 guardsmen and half a dozen hounds, and was making a run for it across the water meadows. If it made it to the birch forest on the other side of the water, they'd never find it again. So if the Duke didn't want to miss out on the trophy of a lifetime, he was going to have to address the boar on horseback. As far as Valen's father was concerned, that wasn't a problem. He galloped off after the boar, leaving his escort behind, and caught it up with it about 300 yards from the edge of the forest, in a small dip littered with granite outcrops. The boar didn't want to stop and turn at bay. It could see safety, and all it had to do was run faster than a horse. The Duke managed to slow it up with an arrow in the left shoulder, but the thought of bringing down such a spectacular animal with a bow didn't appeal to him in the least. Anybody could drain its strength with half a dozen snagging hits and then dispatch it tamely like a farmer slaughtering the family pig. The Duke needed it still to be dangerous when he faced it down the shaft of a number 4 spear, or else it would be a waste. So he urged on his horse and managed to overtake it with 50 yards or less to go. The boar was slowing down, favoring its wounded side, as he surged past it and struck it with his lance. The strike was good, catching the boar just below the ear and killing it outright. But in order to get in close, he pulled his horse in too tight. When the boar dropped, the horse couldn't clear it in time and stumbled, throwing its rider. The Duke fell badly, landing in a nest of granite boulders. His shoulder was smashed, and so was his right eye socket, and when he tried to get up, he found he couldn't move. The dogs had caught up by then, and swarmed over to him to get the boar. Behind them came the front riders, who saw what had happened and tried to lift him until his roars of pain frightened them and they put him down again. It was dark by the time a surgeon arrived from the castle, and the lamps wouldn't stay lit in the rain and wind. Later, they said that if they'd got him to him earlier, or if the huntsman hadn't tried to move him, or if the surgeon had been able to see the full extent of the damage, it might have been different. As it was, there was very little they could do. Valens wasn't there when it happened. He'd stayed back from the main hunt, pretending he had a headache. Then, just after they'd driven the square spinney, he'd been knocked down by an old fat sow nobody'd realized was there. As it happened, he'd suffered nothing more than a bruised shin and a mild scat on the head. But by then, he'd had about as much of his extended birthday as he could take, and lay groaning and clutching at his knee until they loaded him on the game cart and driven him back to the castle. When they brought father home, Valens had been lying on his bed, reading a book, a 12,000-line didactic poem about beekeeping. Everyone was sure his father was going to die, so Valens was hustled down into the courtyard, where they'd rigged up a tent so they wouldn't have to risk taking the Duke up the narrow spiral stairs of the gatehouse. "It's not good." The Chancellor's face was streaked with rain, drops of water running off the spikes of hair plastered to his forehead. Like tears, Valens thought, but really only rainwater. "Truth is, the doctor can't say how bad it is, not without a proper examination, but I think we should assume the worst." He looked harassed, like a man late for an appointment who has to stop and chat with someone he daren't offend. Which means there's a great deal to be done, and not much time. The main thing, of course, is to secure the succession. It was as though he was talking a different language. "I don't understand," Valens said. The Chancellor sighed. "No, I don't suppose you do. Listen, you're 19, so in law, you're still a minor. That means a 3-year regency, so who have we got? There's rules about this sort of thing, obviously, but the fact is that they don't count for all that much when power's at stake. All it takes is a little bit of panic, and all hell's going to break loose." While he was still talking, Valens' mind had jumped ahead. It wasn't something he'd ever considered, because father would live forever, naturally. But now that the concept had been planted so violently in his mind, he was bright enough to see the implications. If there was a free-for-all power struggle in the duchy, there were 3 obvious contenders. His cousin, Count Licinius, commander of the guards. His step-uncle Vetranio, commissioner of the mines, generally acknowledged as the main representative of the mining lobby. His cousin, Count Torquatus, after father the biggest landowner in the duchy. So Licinius had an army, but he was a cautious, unimaginative man, unlikely to take drastic action unless he felt himself threatened. Meanwhile, Torquatus and Vetranio loathed each other, both on a personal level and as representatives of the wool trade and the mines, respectively. As such, either of them would be prepared to do whatever was necessary to stop the other getting power, and the easiest way of doing that would, of course, be to assume it themselves. If Vetranio won the race, Valens wouldn't give much for his chances of seeing his 20th birthday. Vetranio was 3rd in line of succession after his own nephew, Dominicus, a 7-year-old boy that nobody would ever miss. With him and Valens out of the way, Vetranio would be Duke outright. He had 30,000 silver miners at his disposal, as against Licinius' 600 guards. Torquatus could maybe raise 10,000 men from the mountain pastures, but by the time they were all mustered, it'd be over. "What about you?" Valens asked. "Would you do it, please?" The Chancellor looked at him through a curtain of rain. "Me?" "Yes, you." Valens stepped forward. He was shorter by a head than the older man, and as he looked up, the rain stung his eyes. "If father appoints you as regent before he dies, you'll be able to command the guards. You can replace Licinius, arrest Vetranio before they've ever even heard about this. With both of them out of the game, Torquatus will bide quiet and we'll be home and dry." I don't know, the Chancellor said. I'd be taking a hell of a risk, and besides, what if he won't do it? Appoint me, I mean. Or suppose he doesn't wake up. Listen. Valens caught the older man by the arm. It was thin and flabby under the heavy wool robe. You and I go in to see him, with the doctor and a couple of your people you can trust. We come out a minute or so later and make the announcement. I shouldn't have to explain all this, he thought. He's supposed to be the politician. The doctor and your clerks will be the witnesses. It doesn't matter a damn what actually happens, if we're the only ones who know. The Chancellor looked away. Valens could see he was on the point of panic, like someone who's afraid of heights, stuck up a ladder. Too frightened, he might well decide he'd be safer giving his support to someone with rather more power than a 19-year-old kid. It's all right, Valens said firmly. This is something that's just got to be done, that's all. If we're quick and firm, there won't be any trouble. Go on, it'll all be fine. There was a long moment. Valens could see that the Chancellor was past thinking rationally. He was waiting to fall or be pushed into a decision. Here's the doctor coming out, Valens said. Get him, and 2 of your clerks. Go on now. The Chancellor nodded and did what he was told. Valens watched him talk to the doctor, saw him nod his agreement, and only then did it occur to Valens to wonder whether the doctor had any news, whether his father was alive, dead, or dying. He pushed the thought out of his mind, because there was nothing he could do about the particular issue. But the succession had to be dealt with, and there wasn't anybody else to do it. And he watched the Chancellor beckon over a couple of men. Valens knew them by sight, but didn't know their names. And the Chancellor whispered to them. One of them looked worried, the other showed nothing. Valens went to join them. Ready? He said. The Chancellor nodded. The doctor tried to say something, but nobody was listening. Valens led the way into the tent. His father was lying on a table, the clever folding table they took out for the after-hunt dinner, on which they laid out the best joints of newly butchered meat. From the doorway, he looked like he was asleep. A step or so closer, and Valens could see blood, the splintered ends of bones sticking out through incredible red gashes. For just a moment he had to fight to stay in there with that mess. Dad? He said softly. He can't hear you. The doctor's voice, very nervous and strained. He passed out from the pain a few minutes ago. I don't know if he'll wake up again. Valens closed his eyes for a moment. What's the damage? He said. The doctor came a little closer. For a start, he said. Broken skull, collarbone, 3 ribs, left forearm. But that's not the real problem. He's bleeding heavily inside, and he's paralyzed from the neck down. There's several possible causes for that, but I don't yet know which it is. You don't know, Valens repeated. I'm sorry. The doctor was afraid. That was it. Understandable, but it would only get in the way. Until I can do a proper examination. I understand, Valens said, and I know you're doing everything you can. Meanwhile, we need your help. He turned to look at the Chancellor. Does he know what he's got to do? The Chancellor dipped his head slightly. They all do, he said. Right. Valens looked away from the body on the table. Then let's get on with it. In the event, there was no trouble at all. Count Licinius was in bed when a platoon of his own guards brought him the letter and escorted him gently but firmly to a guest room in the castle. It was perfectly pleasant, but it was on the 6th floor of the tower, and 2 men stood guard outside it all night. Vetranio made a bit of a fuss when the guards came for him at his villa on the outskirts of the city. He had guards of his own, and there was an ugly moment when they started to intervene. A sword was drawn, there was a minor scuffle. Vetranio lost his nerve and came quietly, ended up in the room next to Licinius, though neither of them knew it until they were released a week later. By then, the doctors were pleased to be able to announce that the Duke had come through the dangerous phase of his injuries and was conscious again. For Valens, that week was the longest of his life. Once Licinius and Vetranio were safely locked up and everything was quiet, he forced himself to go back down to the courtyard and into the tent. He freely admitted to himself that he didn't want to go. He had no wish to look at the horrible thing his father had turned into, the disgusting shambles of broken and damaged parts. If it was a cart or a plow, you wouldn't bother trying to mend it. You'd dump it in the hedge and build a new one. There were many times during his vigil in the tent when he wished his father would die and be done with it. It'd be better for everyone now that the political situation had been sorted out. He knew, as he sat and stared at his father's closed eyes, that the Duke didn't want to live. Somewhere deep down in his mind, he'd known what had happened to him, the extent of the damage. He'd never hunt again. never walk, never stand up, feed himself. For the rest of his life he'd shit into a nappy like a baby. He'd fought more than his share of wars, seen the terror in the eyes of men he'd reduced to nothing as they knelt before him. He'd far rather die than give them this satisfaction. In fact, Valens recognized he could think of only one person in the world who wanted him not to die, and his reasons were just sentiment, nothing that would survive the brutal interrogation of logic. At some point in the first 24 hours, he'd fallen asleep in his chair. He'd had a dream in which he saw Death standing over the table asking his permission to take his father's life away, like clearing away the dishes after dinner. It seemed such a reasonable request, and refusing it was a foolish, immature thing to do. "You know I'm right," Death's voice said softly inside his head. "It's the right thing to do, and you're being a nuisance." He'd felt guilty when he ordered Death to go away, ashamed of his own petulance, and meanwhile outside the door he could hear Licinius and Vetranio and Torquatus and the Chancellor and everyone else in the duchy muttering about him, how if he couldn't even make a simple decision like this without coming all to pieces, how on earth did he imagine he could ever be fit to govern a country? He felt the leash in his hand, the thin line of rope that tethered his father's life to the tangled mess of bones and wounds on the table. If he let go, it'd all be just fine, it'd be over. He was only hanging on to it out of perversity, contrariness. They should come in, take it away from him, and give it to a grown-up. When he woke up, his father's eyes were open, not looking at him, but out through the tent doorway at the sunlight. Valens sat up, stifled a yawn. Father's eyes moved and met his, and then he looked away. I suppose I ought to say something, he thought, but he couldn't think of anything. Instead, he thought about his prisoners, Licinius and Vetranio, locked up like dogs shut in on a rainy day. Were they pacing up and down, or lying resigned and still on the bed? Had anybody thought to bring them something to read? He was still trying to find some words when the doctor came in, and he carried on trying to find them for the next 4 years until his father died, in the middle of the night, on the eve of Valens' 23rd birthday. But all that time, Valens never said a word, so the last thing he told his father was a lie. "I won't go up to the round wood with you this afternoon. I've got a splitting headache coming on." Not that it mattered. If he'd been there, his father would still have ridden ahead after the boar. The outcome would have been the same in all material respects. Someone had thought to have the boar flayed and the hide made into a rug. They draped it over the coffin when they carried it down to the chapel for burial. It was, Valens thought, a loathsome gesture, but father would have appreciated it. Valens was duly acclaimed duke by the representatives of the district assemblies. There was a ceremony in the great hall, followed by a banquet. The chancellor, Count Licinius, restored to favor. His predecessor had died of a sad combination of ambition and carelessness the previous spring. Took him aside for a quiet word before they joined the guests. Now that Valens was officially in charge of the duchy, there were a few niceties of foreign policy to go through. "Now?" "Now," Licinius replied emphatically. "Things are a bit complicated at the moment. There's things you should be aware of before you go in there and start talking to people." Badly phrased. Licinius was an intelligent man with a fool's tongue, but Valens was used to that. "You don't want me to have to bother my pretty little head about them yesterday, I suppose?" Licinius shrugged. "The situation has been building up gradually for a long time. When it all started, you were still, well, indisposed. By the time you started taking an interest again, it was too involved to explain. You know how it is." "Sure," Valens nodded. "So you're going to have to explain it all in 5 minutes before I go down to dinner." Licinius waited for a moment in case Valens wanted to develop this theme. The pause made Valens feel petty. "Go on," he said. So Licinius told him all about it. Count Serapat, he said, had kept strictly to the letter of the peace treaty that had been signed when Valens was 16. There hadn't been any trouble on the borders, and there was no reason to suppose he wasn't entirely sincere about wanting peace. But things weren't all wine and honey cakes. Serapat had 7 daughters. "I know," Valens interrupted a little abruptly. "I met one of them once. It was when the treaty was signed. She was here as a hostage." Licinius nodded. "That was the 5th daughter, Beatrice. Anyway, shortly after your father had his accident, my predecessor made a formal approach to Serapat for a marriage alliance. In his reply, Serapat—" "Just a moment," Valens interrupted. "Marriage alliance? Who is supposed to be marrying who?" Licinius had the grace to look away. "One of Serapat's daughters, and you, obviously." "Fine," Valens frowned. "Which one?" "I'm sorry?" "Which one of Serapat's daughters?" Licinius frowned, as if this fascination with trivial details perplexed him. The fifth or the sixth, he said. The older four had already been married off. And there's some interesting implication there, because... The fifth or the sixth? They're both pleasant enough, so I've heard. Anyway, Sirapat gave his agreement in principle, as you'd expect, because it's the obvious logical move. Before anybody had made any definite proposals, I took over as Chancellor, which shouldn't have made the slightest bit of difference, obviously. But suddenly, Sirapat wasn't answering my letters. Next thing we hear, he's negotiating a marriage with his sister's eldest son, Orsi. Orsi, Valence repeated. You don't mean my cousin Orsi from Scandia? Licinius said. Well, you can imagine we were a bit stunned. We all assumed it was just tactical, trying to get us to up our offer. So we decided to take no notice. I remember when he came to stay when I was a kid, Valence said. I suppose he was a hostage too, come to think of it. I just assumed he was there because he's an off relation, but we got on really well together. I've often wondered what became of him. Not much, Licinius said. He may be related to our lot and their lot, but really he's nothing more than a small-time country squire. Spends his time counting sheep and checking the boundary fences. But if he were to marry Sarapat's daughter, that'd make him the heir presumptive when Sarapat goes on. Would it? Why? Licinius pulled a face. It's complicated. Actually, I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's because the first three weren't born in the purple, and the fourth came along while the marriage was still nominally morganatic. Anyway, there's a damn good reason. So in practice, Sarapat was practically appointing him as his successor. Assuming the marriage goes ahead, Valence pointed out, and if it's just a bargaining ploy, which is what we'd assumed, Licinius said. But apparently we were wrong. They were married last week. For a moment, Valence felt as though he'd lost his memory. Where he was, what he was supposed to be doing, what he was talking about, all of them on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't quite remember. Last week, he repeated. Bolts out of the blue, literally, Licinius said. No warning, no demands, nothing. Just a report from our ambassador. Not even formal notification from the court, which we're entitled to, incidentally, under the terms of the treaty. Which daughter? Valence said. What? Oh, right. I'm not absolutely sure. I think it was number 5, which would make sense, because they've got rules over there about the order princesses get married in. But if it was number 6, the effect would still be the same. Now, I'm not saying it was meant as a deliberate provocation or an act of war, but can you find out? Valence said. Which one it was, Yes, all right. But like I said, it's not really important. What matters is Sirapat has effectively rejected our claim, some might say the treaty itself, in favor of some nobody who just happens to be a poor relation. So in basic diplomatic terms, find out which one, Valence cut him off. Quickly as possible, please. He could see Licinius getting flustered, thinking he hadn't got across the true magnitude of the political situation. I will, yes, but if you're thinking that's all right, I'll just marry number 6. I've got to tell you that would be a grave miscalculation. You see, under their constitution... Find out, Valence said, raising his voice just a little, and as soon as you hear, let me know, all right? I've already said yes. That's splendid. Valence took a deep breath. That'll have to do as far as the briefing goes. We can't keep all the guests waiting. Licinius had his answer within the hour. Yes, it was the 5th daughter, Beatrice, who had married Count Orsi. Licinius' scribbled note reached Valens at the dinner table, where he was sandwiched in between the patriarchal legate, a serene older man who dribbled soup, and a high-ranking Byzantine commercial attaché. Consequently, he read the note quickly, tucked it into his sleeve, and carried on talking to the legate about the best way to blanch chicory. The next day, for the first time since his father's accident, he announced a hunt. Since everybody was unprepared and out of practice, it would be a simple perfunctory affair. They would draw the home coverts in the morning and drive down the mill stream in the afternoon. The announcement caused some surprise. People had got the impression from somewhere that the new duke wasn't keen on hunting, and a great deal of anxious preparation and last-minute dashing about in stables, kennels, and tack rooms. Any annoyance, however, was easily outweighed by relief that things were getting back to normal.